This is the, 9th episode or something like that of the Existential Ambiguity podcast.
I thought you were going to say the 9th take.
Well, this is the third try for this particular one. It seems like every time we got interrupted or had a cell phone coming through the microphone or some darn thing. So now maybe we'll actually get to do it. This is Buddha Vangsa.
And Dhamma Vangsa.
The Vangsa brothers. And we're trying to go through Weti Muni's book, The Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. It's an existential view of the Buddha's teaching. Existentialism is a really good context to bring the Buddha's teaching into Western culture. And that's because existentialism includes a very nice, complete understanding of ontology. Earlier, about 10 years ago, when I was studying Vedanta, I was concerned that no matter how I tried to bring the language of Vedanta into English, it seemed to come out all distorted. So finally, because of another thing I was studying technology. I had a website at the time called New Science Paradigms. And this is just when Web 2.0 was coming out, and the World Wide Web Consortium, the 3WC, was just defining their standards for web ontology.
Wow.
So I started to study ontology and very quickly realized that this had a tremendous potential for bringing in the actual Eastern philosophy undistorted into Western language.
It's one of the nicer tools you've picked up along the way.
Yeah, very useful tool. Why? Because an ontology is a statement of categories of existence and their relationships.
Yeah. Definitions and relationships.
Right. And it's extensible by nature.
You can always expand on it.
That's right. If the required relationship doesn't exist in the Western languages, you can add it. You can create it. You can coin a new term.
Yes.
To describe it.
The science of how to create science.
That's right. Every science that has been created started with a list of terminology. And the terminology is called a taxonomy. And that is simply a list of the things that are going to be studied.
Yes.
And then gradually filling in their relations. And with this language, you can then make assertions and test them with experiments, and boom, you got a science.
You can study it systematically.
Yes. Before that, you're just playing around. You don't have you don't have a map.
No.
Huh? It's just like if you go into a place that you've never been before, and there's all kinds of cool stuff, but unless you write it down and make a map, you can't bring that understanding, that experience back with you.
No.
You leave it there. So we were studying consciousness. And we knew that we were in an area where Western language doesn't have much terminology.
Yeah.
And we were trying to bring in new terminology to describe these different states of consciousness.
Yeah.
But, of course, most people are allergic to Sanskrit. So we tried to coin Western terms, but it still didn't quite make it. Then we discovered ontology, and after that, everything was, well, not easy, but easier in the sense that now we had a tool that was adequate for the job.
Yeah.
We weren't trying to squeeze terms into psychology or other areas that really weren't big enough to hold them. And this is the big problem with Western studies of consciousness, that all the disciplines, all the sciences that have been invented so far in the West are actually too small to hold it. So what we need to do is to take ontology and use the tools of ontology to develop a new language, a language that can hold it.
And we have to have labels and categories for all those states of mind. If not, we won't be conscious of them, right? It will happen.
If you have an experience and you don't have an ontological category for that experience, you will not be able to recognize it. And recognition, remember, a root structure, recognizing X as X, recognizing what it is the first step of apprehending anything.
So you may have an experience, but you won't be able to remember it or reproduce it or anything like that.
Yeah, you won't be able to use it anymore.
You won't even remember it, probably.
Most likely, most of the time. So people have spiritual experiences all the time because we are spiritual beings, but we don't remember them or we don't value them properly because we don't have a framework, we don't have a system of terminology to begin with, and of mechanics of consciousness. Yes. Just like we have quantum mechanics, we have ordinary mechanics, but we don't have a mechanics of consciousness that allows us to manipulate our consciousness.
Quantum mechanics is the first example of the established science trying to bring consciousness into it.
Well, yeah, they
it's
try.
It's still a big black box.
It is, and they don't really define consciousness adequately.
They just say observer.
We found that we had to bring a whole new terminology in, borrowed from Sanskrit.
Yes,
because that's the only existing terminology that describes these states.
Or Pali.
Pali in the case of the Buddha's teaching.
Yeah.
So Pali is, of course, a popular version or dialect of Sanskrit, and many of the words are similar or even the same. But the difference between the Sanskrit literatures and the Pali literatures are that the Sanskrit Vedic literatures are always trying to create or maintain or improve an eternal self.
They're trying to sell you a self.
That's right. That's right. With every phrase, with the definition of every word, that assumption is always present.
And they do it in such a beautiful way.
Well, very artistic. They know all the buttons to push, you know.
They know bhava, they know feeling, they know many states of mind that are perceived as pleasurable because it's such a refined form of suffering.
Yes, it's a well-developed science of getting people to buy into the idea that there is an eternal self. Not only is there an eternal self, but there is an eternal source of eternal selves, and that's called Bhagavan or God. And
all of that is outside of the material world, outside of direct experience.
That's the point. It's outside of experience. It has to be taken on faith.
Yeah.
Every religion in the world has this common feature. They talk about another world where you live forever and there's no problems, there's no troubles, no suffering. But that world cannot be perceived, cannot be experienced, and therefore its existence cannot be proved. You have to simply take it on faith because so-and-so said so.
Yes. The old book said so, or the guru said so.
Right.
Or the priest, or whatever.
So now this is relevant to our discussion, where we are in Weti Muni's book. We are in the middle of the 4th chapter. discussing the root structure of the Putujana's consciousness, the Putujana's reflexive experience. He says, but what does exist in the Putujana's every reflexive experience is the involuntary perception that he will continue, that he will be, that he will not pass away. Every instant of being requires the assumption of continuation of being. So being is an instantaneous phenomenon. It happens only in the present. The past is gone, and the future is not here yet, and it never will be. It will always be the future. So the only time we have for actual being is in the moment, in the present. So there are many moments, instants of being, each of which is founded upon a particular sense experience. We went through this earlier, talking about the root structure. If you haven't heard the previous versions or previous editions of this podcast, you may need to go back and review them, or at least read through chapter 4 of Wettimuni's book, so you understand the context that we're talking about. We're talking about the root structure, which is described in the Mula Pariyaya Sutta by the Buddha, where he says that clinging is developed in a process of 6 stages. Okay? And each instant of being includes all these 6 stages. And they begin with the immediate experience.
Well, it contains from 1 to 6.
Yes.
Not always all the way down to...
Oh, yes.
Oh, always,
yes.
all of them.
Yes, they are going on in parallel. Even though, conceptually speaking, each one is the foundation for the next stage.
But you're not always delighting, for example.
Well, yeah, you are. If you have an I, you are.
Okay, you are always delighting in the idea.
Yes,
of yourself.
because as he was saying, the continuation of being is an assumption present in each instant of being. Similarly, the assumptions of pleasurableness are there.
It's always there in a subtle way.
Yes. Permanence and pleasurableness are there as assumptions. They're not always explicit. They can be very hidden, buried.
But they're part of the context.
Yes, the context. And the context is what determines the meaning. So the meaning of every experience that we have in ordinary consciousness is that I shall be, and this shall be mine, and I shall enjoy it.
Yes.
Okay. Pleasurableness, I will enjoy. I will continue. Permanence, I will continue to enjoy.
Can always enjoy this thing.
I, the owner of this, will continue to enjoy it indefinitely. That is the assumption behind each moment of being in quotation marks. It's not real being because it has a beginning and an end.
Yeah.
It has a beginning when we first come in contact with the sense object that we're building our I and mind on. And it has an end when things change. And that thing goes out of our experience.
Another thing takes its place.
Yes, and that can happen very quickly. It can happen in a fraction of a second. When we're in the middle of a complicated scene with lots of stuff going on, you know, a lot of people around, things happening, a sports stadium full of people, a big game, something like that. There can be literally dozens of sense impressions per second. And each one of them is the basis for an I. An I and a mine. The thing that we perceive, we subjugate it. We make it ours. We cling to it, make it mine, and then we build an I on that. And the nature of that I is that I am the possessor and enjoyer of this thing. Isn't it? So every moment that we're in contact with some sense object, which is every moment of consciousness.
Yeah.
In the ordinary state of consciousness, we're doing this I dance. We're making this I. Everything we experience is with reference to our I, ourself. The world that we experience is about ourself.
It's our world.
Yes. We see it that way. We see it like the world revolves around us. This is ordinary consciousness. Now, let's talk about it some more. So, the question of duration, whether we'll continue for some time or for all time, forever, eternally, whatever, is a secondary matter that appears only in deliberate reflection.
We might think that we're going to die sometimes, but we're never going to die now.
Right.
Yeah.
And we might think that we're eternal, but we don't really think that in the moment unless we're deliberately sitting down to think about that. Usually we just have the assumption that I'm going to continue. So the question of duration of being is not part of the Putujana's each and every reflexive experience. It is the subtle perception of merely continuing, of being. Being implies a duration in time.
Yeah. We're not going to stop being anytime soon.
Even though the actual experience is momentary, instantaneous.
It's one way of being, and then you shift to another object. It's a new cycle of being.
Right.
Every time you shift to a new sense object.
With every sense object you experience. That's true. There's some, even if you're not, like Buddha Das talked about in that lecture, even if you're not actively creating something I and mine to enjoy, subtly the assumption is that I am sitting here listening to a lecture, or I am considering this idea, or whatever it is. It can be very subtle.
Very subtle. Because you've done it previously. Just a few minutes ago you had I, so it's kind of lingering in the context.
Yes, and it's a habit. We can't give it up without making a certain kind of effort. And that effort is the Buddha's teaching. And we'll get to that, the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the key of how you get out of this. Right now we're trying to talk about the nature of the trap. The nature of the structure that holds us, or actually that we hold ourselves to.
The burning thing in our hand.
Yeah, the hair on fire. So we have this permanence, this feeling of permanence. It's not exactly an accurate rendering of the Pali, navayo. Navayo means doesn't go away, not passing away. But we'll use permanence because it's much easier to say permanence and impermanence than it is to say not passing away and not passing away.
And we would say that instead of saying passing away, because it's an existential language. So you're using it as an equation.
We are. We're trying to use language like math, where every word has a specific definition. And you have to be aware of that definition to understand what we're talking about. Yeah. Generally, we use the dictionary definitions of the terms, except with certain technical terms in Buddhism that simply don't have any translation. And in that case, we either use the Pali directly, like in the case of Putujana, or we will make up an English phrase like permanence when we understand that permanence is simply not passing away. But that's one of the standard meanings of permanence. So in general, we use the dictionary meaning of the terms unless we announce it. Yes. That's a special term. Now, the perception of permanence is always structurally related with the perception of pleasurableness. What do we mean structurally related? We mean that whenever one thing shows up, the other thing has to show up in the neighborhood.
Part related. Of the same structure.
Yeah, they're related to each other. They support one another. They're part of the same structure.
Of the fabricated self.
Yeah, so that structure is revealed if you've seen our recent video, How to Realize Not Self, then there's a graphic that shows this process of making I and mine in the shape of a pyramid. Okay? So this is the structure. And the terms or perceptions that are part of that structure are I am, this is mine, the perception
this is myself.
of myself, pleasurableness, and permanence. And in the beginning, they're implicit. They're not direct. They're not open. They're almost like a seed, which is projected into the perception of the object.
You conceive. The experience is pregnant with the idea of I and mine.
Yeah. That means it's not apparent right away.
It
takes some time to develop. Right. And another good example of the seed is that the seed requires nourishment. Okay, not only time but nourishment. And of course the nourishment is the sense perception itself. And our inclination toward I-making and mind-making. So these perceptions of this is mine and I am are generally called being. Being with quotation marks, because again, it's not real being.
It's constructed being.
Yes. It's not authentic being. There can be temporary being, which is not, absolute or real being, but which is authentic, as in the case of the arhat. But this is being that is fabricated.
Yeah.
It's blatantly plastic, phony.
Something on top of and obscuring real being.
That's right. So this feeling of being is always associated with perceptions of permanence and pleasurableness. They're not always explicit, but nevertheless, wherever there is subjectivity, the feeling of I am, they are also there, if only to a very slight degree, maybe in seed form. Subjectivity and the perceptions of permanence and pleasurableness are structurally inseparable. Now, we're going to discuss an example that will reveal that through its obverse, the experience of the sudden apprehension of death.
Obverse?
Obverse. Let's look it up here in a dictionary. Mr. Oxford, what do we mean by obverse? The side of a coin or metal bearing the head or principal design. That's not it. How about the second one? The opposite or counterpart of a fact or truth. The opposite or counterpart.
Not opposite.
Counterpart is not exactly opposite. It's like left-handedness and right-handedness. If you have both hands, and one of them is left, and one of them is right. It's not that the right hand is the opposite of the left hand, or vice versa, but they're counterparts. They're opposite in a certain way, but in another way, they are part and parcel of the same thing. Complements, yes. So, the sudden apprehension of death. Let's look up apprehension. Apprehension is anxiety or fear that something bad or unpleasant will happen. So the anxiety or fear that death, something bad, will happen, is such a shocking and unpleasant experience. Shock is acute disappointment or unexpectedness, concentrated in a very short period of time. Change is one of the causes of suffering, according to the Buddha.
Yeah.
So when change happens, this is one of the things our ontological research brought out back in 2004. We were saying that the rate of change due to technology alone was going to become so acute in about 10 years, which is now, that people would start just going crazy.
Yeah.
they'd start losing it. And sure enough, look at the papers any day, and there's some story of some poor guy holding himself up with his family and shooting everybody and then shooting himself. Or just going out to the mall or the movie theater and opening fire. And then winding up, they always wind up killing themselves. They just can't take it anymore.
No.
Why? Because ontologically, their system of meaning cannot keep up with the changes in this world.
There are so many new categories emerging all the time.
Yeah.
And also they are removed in their experience from all these categories, so they're all abstract categories that they never
That's right.
really realize.
They're full of misunderstood terms. They're reading about this stuff in the news and they have no idea what it means.
They're being brainwashed by media and school.
It looks very threatening. So threatening that they completely lose it.
Yeah. They don't even want to think about those things, and then they take shelter of smaller worldviews, like a football team or intoxication or whatever.
Yeah, they contract instead of expanding, and that makes them increasingly unable to deal with the reality, which is always expanding. People know nothing about ontology because this subject is deliberately hidden in our educational system. You don't get to study ontology until graduate school. Even the word is unknown. When we say the word ontology, people's eyes glaze over. They don't know what we're talking about. But it's the science of being. And what are we? We're human beings.
Yes.
So ontology is really part of what we are. And yet most people have no clue about it. And this is only because it was designed this way. It was set up this way. That school will teach you about having and doing, and maybe a little bit about thinking and knowing, just enough to get by. But we really don't want people to get into that stuff because it's dangerous.
Yeah. Ontology is also the science of existence of not only your being, but also everything in the world.
Yeah.
So you should really, from people are very young, they should add a few ontological categories every day to their set of possibilities, what exists.
Well,
in the world.
if they knew that was important, maybe they would do that.
Yeah, but they think they know everything that needs to be known once they're like out of high school or whatever.
Well, what needs to be known is whatever it takes to get through the day at school.
Yeah,
and that's it.
Win the high school game. Yeah.
Yes, so people are educated in the subject of getting through school. They're not educated in any other practical realm.
No.
Unless they take their education into their own hands.
Dealing with the group mind, that's what they learn in school.
That's all they learn in school.
And obeying authority.
Yeah, school was designed by industrialists to train workers for factories. Okay, look up the history. Look up any video by John Taylor Gatto on YouTube. He explains the whole thing very nicely. We're not going to go into that here, but we're going to take it as a given that the educational system is designed to make you dumb and to look at things backwards and to keep you from learning anything practical. Like, for example, how to learn. In school, you don't learn how to learn. You only learn how to get through school.
So you wonder why everyone's so stupid. Here's the explanation. Now it all makes sense.
Yeah, if you take up your experience of going to school in the context of this is a program of social control designed to make you lose your taste for learning, then you'll say, oh, I get it. Right.
And remove you from your own experience, from your own feelings.
Make you identify as a member of a group, your class, your third class, second class, fourth class, or grade as we call it in the United States, third grade, fourth grade, like that. You're made to identify, and you are given a permanent identity, your school record. You're given a social security number and a grade, and that's it. And your performance is measured in terms of symbols that you know. Not things that you can do, but just the names of things. The ability to pass a multiple choice test.
You got an A. Whoop-de-doo, what can you do now?
Yeah, right. Like, that's really going to make a difference in your life. I'm sorry.
Or you got an F. So
it's just
so what?
It's just so pathetic that people don't see this and don't fight against it by going out and actually learning how to learn.
Yeah.
And one of these days I'm going to repost that video because that was a good one.
So the thing is, people seem to be stupid, but it isn't because they are inherently stupid. It's because they've been trained that way.
That's right.
And everyone, absolutely, I think everyone could break out of that.
If they saw the need.
If they saw the need and they saw the opportunity for it.
But the thing is, they're in a paper bag. Now, a paper bag, you can easily puncture or tear and get out of your paper bag. Huh? It's very insubstantial. But people don't.
No.
Because they see no need. Oh, I'm in the paper bag, I'm safe.
Government will take care of me.
Lots of luck with that.
They'll really take care of you.
Yeah. So, at some point, the rude awakening is going to occur that I am going to die. No matter how much pleasurableness you can create for yourself with the false idea that I'm going to continue indefinitely, at some point, life is going to come knocking on your door with clear evidence that you are not going to make it. Okay? And for me, this happened about 1.5 years ago. And my response to it was to completely change gear, go back into research mode, and find out the cause and the solution. Now, most people, maybe they don't have those kind of inner resources. So what happens when they get the knock on the door that now you are not going to be anymore, they freak out. They don't know how to handle it. They're in suffering. They're over their heads in suffering. Because all this time they were going on the assumption that they were permanent.
Yeah. They were refining that constructed self, and then something happens to it.
They were implicitly always thought, I will be. And now they see I will not be anymore. So this perception of death means the realization of impermanence in its fullest force. Everything that I call I is not going to exist anymore. And you know, the last time that we tried to record this thing, we got into a good riff on it. And I want to get back into that. The crucible, which is a test by life. And of course, the biggest crucible is always about death.
Yeah.
But when this crucible comes, is something that most people don't recall because they've buried it. It's when the first love affair fails. Because permanence and pleasurableness, remember, are structurally inseparable. Permanence and pleasurableness. So, when the person first falls in love, and because,
creates an I based on...
They create a very strong I based on this very strong sensation of pleasure. And then
union with this sense object.
Right, and then the whole thing crashes and burns, which it does far more often than not. One is confronted with the feeling of death. I don't care what they say, I won't stay in a world without love. The old song. That people feel like they're dying when a love affair fails.
Yeah.
And they are. The I, based on that experience, is dying, is finished, is no more. It's gone. Impermanence. So impermanence hits us with the force and the feeling of death. And what to speak of actual death, even just the death of a very strong, very important, very passionate ego is enough to throw us into existential crisis. So the I that we have is always implicitly or explicitly assumed to be permanent and pleasurable. And the feeling of pleasurableness that we get from our I is very much tied up with its a feeling of permanence. Like we talked about the difference between pleasure and pleasurableness. That pleasure is a physical sensation. Pleasurableness is a mental sensation of pleasure. And the same with suffering and displeasurableness. Okay, pain or suffering and displeasurableness are the physical and mental counterparts of it, respectively. So you can have a sensation that's physically pleasant, but mentally displeasurable because of its meaning or significance. Your old girlfriend that dumped you 5 years ago, you run into her at the class reunion and she gives you a hug. And it's like, oh, it's displeasurable, right? Because it brings back the whole experience of being dumped. But the physical sensation is nice, it's pleasant. Or, let's take another one, eating very hot chili. The physical sensation by itself is painful, but the overall sensation is pleasurable, mental sensation, because it's tied up with taste and the fact you know it's good for your digestion and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's very possible to have a painful sensation that's pleasurable or a pleasant sensation that's displeasurable mentally according to its meaning.
I was starting to think something showed up in my space about why people are addicted to intoxication and different things, and why they can't give it up. And it's because giving it up means letting that self die.
Yes.
You know, you keep on doing this bad habit because giving it up would be to commit suicide.
There's some pleasure associated with that I.
Both with
or at least some relief from suffering.
And also some subtle sense of identity connected with the habit.
That's right. Why do people have drinking buddies, for example, that they only hang out with when they're drinking? See? Or stoners or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's because those eyes have those associations. The person has one eye at home. He has another eye at work or at school. And then when he goes to party, he has a different eye, a different self, with different tastes, different language, different bodily expressions, and so forth. And you can see this. Actors are very good at this. They know about this, explicitly or implicitly.
Yes.
And they're able to switch between eyes. They usually get all messed up. They start to develop personality problems because which one is the real I?
Yeah. They assume one of them has to be the real I. So the actors really need the Buddha's teaching.
Oh, they really need it.
Because they're schizophrenic by definition.
Yeah. They get that way.
But everyone is.
Everyone has multiple eyes.
Yeah.
And they all know each other. They come into contact at the edges when one is out the door and the other one's coming in. Oh, hi, have a good night. Bye.
It depends on the context, but it also depends on it's a different eye for each and every sense object.
Actually, it is. If we look into the process of eye making, every impression actually generates a different eye. And there are classes of similar eyes based on similar perceptions and so on. But generally, the process of eye making requires the presence of a sense object. There's no such thing as, quote, pure awareness.
No.
Awareness always has to have an object.
And when we say sense object, the sixth sense in the Buddha's teaching is the mind.
The mind.
So it can
a mental
be a thought
object.
or feeling or perception.
Or a category, or a name, a designation that one is identified with, or like that. So anything considered as a particular phenomenon always has certain associated significances. Things aren't just things. A cigar isn't just a cigar, as Freud would say.
It is an intention there. It's a function.
Yeah. Yes. For example, the consideration of a lump of matter in front of me as a chair is associated with or structurally inseparable from the notion of being seated on it. If I can sit on it, it's a chair. If I take the chair apart, like I was sitting on this chair yesterday, spontaneously disintegrated.
It's no longer a chair, dude.
No.
It's a back. The two rear legs are missing, so it's like on the side there, and it's not. It's just some contorted plastic.
Yeah, it's just a lump of matter, which is really all it ever was.
Yeah.
But when it had the function of a chair, we called it a chair.
Yeah.
Now we just call it a piece of junk to get rid of as soon as possible, because it doesn't perform its function. Its meaning is gone or changed. So this is called the intention of an object. Because every time we perceive an object, it's with some intention. We want to enjoy it or use it in some way.
How can I use it? Yeah.
Yeah. So the significance or intention must be present, or we no longer cognize the object. This is what we were talking about before with spiritual experiences. If there's no cognizing, this is an experience of such and such, no self or emptiness or something like that.
I don't have a name for the experience.
If you don't have a name, you don't have a designation or category for it, then it's like it never happened. It has no meaning for you.
There has to be both name and form.
Yes. So likewise, the notion of I, or the consideration of a thing as I, my car, my clothes, my chair, my body, is always associated with certain significances or intentions. And the chief among these are the perceptions of permanence and pleasurableness. Why do people buy houses? They're expensive. They're hard to maintain. You have to pledge yourself to 30 years of monthly payments, and if you screw up, you can lose the whole thing. Why would anybody do that to themselves? Because of the feeling of permanence. This is my house.
And the value will go up, and I will make a lot of money sitting on this house.
But that's secondary. The primary thing, the pleasure that people get from owning a home is the feeling of permanence. That I can live here and nobody nobody can make me move. This is my castle.
I will be safe here.
So I is always associated with certain significance or intentions. I has no meaning without these significances. If you get a house and let's say there's no floor, the windows are broken, the roof leaks, like that, and you don't consider this is my home. It doesn't have the same meaning because it doesn't have the same function, just like the broken chair. So it has no meaning without these significances, and nothing lacking those perceptions can be considered as I. In other words, the notion of subjectivity, I and mine, is always correlated with perceptions of permanence and pleasurableness. And that's why the feeling of death is so uncomfortable. The premonition, or what do they say in existentialism? The
apprehension.
No, the imminent death. Because you never actually experience death. By the time death comes, you're gone. The body is no longer able to support life. So you're not even there when death actually happens. But the anticipation of death is the root cause of anxiety. And now we know, of course, that this death could be the death of the body, or it also could be the death of an ego, the death of a false I based on something. If someone's going to lose their home, why is it such a big deal that all these mortgage what do they call foreclosures are happening? Because they're losing a big sense of part of their identity. My home. They're losing that. So, of course, that's because they created it in the first place. Then they're subject to losing it. But we're talking about, why do people create these things in the first place? That's the stage of the discussion we are at. Okay? Now, as we mentioned, there is no mine or am or being apart from something taken to be mine or am or being. It always has to be, this is mine, this I am, or this is my being. Despite whatever mystical beliefs one may have about the existence of the soul and so on and so forth, there's no such thing as pure being apart from experience.
No. There are elevated states of consciousness, but still they manifest once the mind becomes concentrated on one object.
The Buddha says that you can even have the experience of nothingness, and if you're attached to it, it's still false ego. Very refined, very high, but still false. My nothingness, right? The immediate experience, that means the actual sense impressions, together with taking the experience to be I and mine, in other words, the meaning of it that we add, is what gives the individual being, quote unquote.
Constructed being, fabricated being.
Right. That house is just sitting there anyway. It might have even been built, before you were born. And it might, if it's well made, it might exist for a long time after you're gone. But still, when you, quote, own it, you think of it as my home. So this is something that we add to the immediate experience of simply seeing the house. The house is there. The land is there. This idea of a person owning land, this is one of the nuttiest things in our culture, that the land was there for millions of years in the past. It's going to be there for who knows how long in the future. But yet, we put a fence around it and we say, this is my land.
Earth is for me.
And then we're willing to defend it. And in some states, you can even use firearms if somebody trespasses on your land.
Steps on your land, you can shoot them.
Yeah, Texas, for example. So this is the craziness, the degree of insanity that is going on this planet, that people are taking these things that exist anyway, and then they're branding them with this I and mine. And making an I out of it, and then they become very attached to that I. I am the owner of this land. And they're willing to hurt other people. Or this is my religion, this is my God, and your God is wrong, and we're going to come with armies and invade your country and get rid of you. I mean, this is really serious stuff going down over simply a notion of I, either personalized, particularized, projected into a thing, into a possession, into a piece of land, or projected on the whole universe as God. And people are willing to die, to fight and die or kill others over this projected ego that they lay on the whole universe.
Post-dated check that you will exist in some other world that's unprovable.
I mean, really.
Well, there might be a God, there might be other worlds, but we don't have any experience of it.
Well, there certainly are beings that are greater than human, and there certainly are, other planets and maybe even other dimensions and stuff like that. We can't really know anything about them until we're there.
Buddha doesn't even want to talk about it because it's not really relevant to our problem.
No, the problem is we're creating a false I.
Yeah.
We're creating a false ego, and because of that, we're suffering. As soon as things change so that it doesn't support that ego anymore, whether we're talking about identifying with a house, a car, or a name, a title, a university degree, or even like a programming language. There are people who are all bent out of shape because the only programming language they know is Fortran, and it's going out of style, And they're very upset, they feel like they're dying, like they're useless, like just because of the language. What to speak of actual physical death, which is certainly going to happen to everyone.
Yeah.
So the question is, why are we doing it to ourselves? Why? Well, I had an insight about this the other day. At some point in our lives, we probably were very young, and we saw these big, powerful people around us, our parents, who literally had to take care of our every need, and if they didn't, we would be in serious trouble. And they have this thing called I.
They were throwing this I around.
Yeah. I, and they were addressing you as you. As if you also were another I. And one day you got the idea. You said, oh, they have an I. So I should also have an I. Okay. And then you start to see how they treat you, and you start to treat them the same way. That you're mine. You're my mom. You're my dad.
This is my stuff.
This is my body. That's your body. I get it.
And the parents are like, yay!
Yeah, right. You get all kinds of approval for this. So early in life, the first separation occurs at birth. Then you start to realize yourself as an individual. Well, that's all right. But at a certain point, then you begin to create I. I is separate from you. You have a name and I have a name. We can call each other by those names. You see, it's very convenient in the beginning.
But you can't touch my stuff.
Keep your hands out of that liquor cabinet, Junior. And keep your paws off the kitchen counter. Get your mitts out of that cookie jar. So there's mine, too. And mine is a big deal. Somebody said 3/4 is probably more like 80% of the law is about mine. What is mine and what is yours? And what is stuff worth? And how do we pay each other for it? And all of this stuff about stuff. So there are all these considerations about mine. I, me, and mine. These are the big subjects in life. They're the things that determine, in many cases, whether people live or die.
Yes.
In some cases, you can be killed for having the wrong I.
Yes.
Having
Very
the wrong
easily.
religion or something like that. In a time of religious extremism. So I'm not going to get into the subject of religion right now, but we are going to get into it at some point and show how it's simply the projected I, the projected self on the whole universe. Now we went over time. We got into it. I got into my rap about I. But anyway, we have to use this terminology because it's embedded in the language. And we try to use it in a way that reflects our understanding that these things are impermanent. And there's just symbols basically talking about bodies, this body or that body. We try not to load the symbols with too much significance because they don't really have it. Even in the case of someone who is identified with something, that thing is impermanent. They may not think so, but in truth,
they will find out sooner or later that it's impermanent, and so it becomes unpleasurable.
Yeah, and at that point, then either they have to find a new thing to identify with, or they have to take up the Buddha's teaching and try to understand why they're suffering. So, better that someone takes up this teaching before that happens, while they're still in a good space. Unfortunately, that usually doesn't happen.
No.
And instead, they wind up waiting until there's the hour of need and necessity. And then if they're fortunate, if they're in good association, if they have access to spiritual information, if they can think properly, they may come to this understanding. Now, that's what happened to me. I was forced into a crisis by some people taking advantage of a situation that I was in, and I had to deal with it. Fortunately, I was already familiar with Eastern thought, philosophy, Sanskrit, meditation, all these things. And while doing the research on the explicit problem that was manifesting, which was a problem of leadership, I came across information that linked back to ontology and the existentialism and the teaching of the Buddha.
Yeah.
So one thing led to another, and I found myself in Thailand on a beach meditating, and all this light was cascading through my brain, and I went, who needs this eye? You know? I mean, who needs it? It's just, it's a vulnerability. It's a thing that people can take advantage of to hurt you.
Yeah.
We really don't need it. And one thing led to another, and here I am, a monk in a Buddhist monastery in the middle of the jungle. So, fortunately, we have internet, so we can get this to you. But you can do the same thing anywhere. Really, the intent is the main thing.
Seeing that the eye is a fabrication and starting to unlearn or train yourself not to come up with the eye.
Yeah.
Through just awareness of your experience.
Seeing the need for it in any condition of life.
Yeah.
If you're in a good condition of life, if you're young, strong, intelligent, have good facility, so much the better for you. You can learn this now. And then later on, when things change, not if, when things change, you will be so glad you had this knowledge in reserve to help you deal with it.
Yeah. When the body starts breaking down, you might still feel pain, but you won't suffer because of it.
Yeah.
Or when
pain is inevitable.
Yeah. When relatives die.
Suffering is optional.
When your stuff gets destroyed.
Yeah, it's going to happen. It happens to everyone.
Yes.
Time is munching on. Ow. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this podcast. We're really running out of time. We try to keep it to half an hour, but it always seems to go over. We get into talking about this stuff, and we think it's really cool. We hope you do too, and I hope we get the benefit out of it.
We still use I and mine in our language when we try to discuss these things. But if you want an example of someone who writes without the I, Buddha Das is doing a pretty good job.
That's amazing. Yeah, his language is just amazing. So, we can get into Buddha Das at a later time. We'll take this and put it in the can for now, and we'll see you next time for more existential ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.